Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we are going to be in conversation about a history of transgenderism. In fact, a history before we even get the word transgender itself. A history that goes back thousands of years, that goes through all over the world and through all cultures, and a history that includes some of the most powerful kings, queens, and emperors. My guest for this conversation is Kit Heyam. Kit Heyam is a university lecturer, a queer history activist, and a trans awareness trainer. Kit Heyam is the author of the book Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. Kit Heyam, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
And your book is just out, so congratulations on that. I enjoyed very much preparing for our conversation. Let's begin with the word transgender itself and the history of the word. And it's important to keep in mind the history of this word because you outline a very deep history that existed long before we get the word transgender. So tell me about the history of the word transgender.
Well, it's important to say that, of course, while the word transgender itself is relatively new, the concept, the idea that we can go beyond the bodies that we have and the gender categories that we have is very much not. And that's exactly, of course, what Before We Were Trans is about the fact that long before we had the idea or the concept of being trans, there have always been people who have been disrupting and challenging and redefining gender. The word transgender itself is a 20th century coinage. It really kind of gained popularity with the publication of the fantastic Leslie Feinberg's book, Transgender Warriors. And initially, it was being used as a kind of bigger umbrella term than the term transsexual, which had been coined to represent specifically people who were going through some kind of medical transition. And that, of course, nowadays is not really a distinction that many trans people like to draw. The idea that we should talk about people differently depending on what they've chosen to do with their body is not an idea that a lot of trans people now feel particularly comfortable with. I certainly would not like to be defined on the basis of what medical interventions I have or haven't had. That's private information that, I don't want to broadcast with the label that I choose for myself. But in the past, that distinction was initially important. And so the word transgender was a kind of more capacious version of transsexual. But when I use the term trans history now, and as you know in the book, I talk about the importance of the difference between saying people in the past were trans people, which I wouldn't necessarily say if they didn't use a word to describe themselves. It's certainly not for me to impose that word upon them. But I do think that we can talk conversely about trans history, that being the history of the disruption of gender and the movability of gender and the redefinition of gender. And so while the word transgender is new, the idea of trans history, I would say, is something that's much, much, much older.
Yeah, of course. And that's what we're going to dive into. A follow-up question to the word transgender. Is it related to transvestite? And has it been used in a positive way, in a descriptive way, a derogatory way? How has the word historically been used and perceived?
That's a really good question, because actually one of the unique things about the word transgender is that it emerges within trans communities as opposed to outside them. So transvestite is the word that was coined by Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist, sexual scientist in the early 20th century. He was actually using it, although we think of transvestite now as just a word that's sort of about gender expression, about what clothes you choose to wear, not necessarily saying anything about your identity. That's not how Hirschfeld was using it. He was using it to mean basically the same as what we now use the word transgender to mean, an umbrella term, including people who choose to dress in a way that's different from the gender they were assigned at birth, and people who choose to go through medical transition. He coined that term in the early 20th century. The word transsexual is a more medicalized term that followed on from that, but the word transgender is a word that trans people themselves started using, sometimes to say, this is a state that I'm in where I'm choosing not to have medical transition, as I said, sometimes just to say we need a bigger umbrella term that covers people who do go through medical transition and people who don't. And the uniqueness of that word as a word that's been claimed by people to describe themselves rather than a word that's been imposed on people makes it quite sort of politically significant, I guess, I think.
Tell me about the process of researching this history that you have done and so I guess some of the joys, but also some of the challenges.
Well, it certainly is a challenge because one of I suppose, two particular challenges that I faced during the writing of this book. One of them was very specific to the time when I was writing it. I wrote this book in 2020 and 2021. So in an ideal world, I would have loved to visit a lot of archives and a lot of libraries in order to research this book. In the world that we live in, however, I was mostly confined to my house and making the best use that I could of the fantastic efforts of archivists and librarians across the world to put as many of their collections online as possible. So, for example, some of the early American stories that I tell are based on sources that are held in Yale University Library, who have very kindly made those sources available online. So despite the fact that I couldn't travel to Yale, I was able to make use of that. That was a challenge that was specific to the pandemic, but the challenge that would have faced me no matter when I was writing this book is the fact that a lot of the sources, the vast majority actually of the sources that we have that represent gender nonconformity in the past are hostile sources. So they're sources written by people in legal contexts who are prosecuting people for some kind of gender nonconformity, or they're written from a religiously judgmental point of view, or they're written from an anthropological point of view. A lot of the sources that I read to talk about gender nonconformity in cultures that are not my own were sources that were written from, frankly, a racist perspective, that were pointing out what they saw as kind of abominations or transgressive behavior in cultures that were not their own. And
because gender is perceived differently in different cultures.
Absolutely, yes. And so, for example, when European colonizers encountered what we now call two-spirit people in North America, they approached that as sexual transgression and gender transgression, and they wrote about it in those incredibly judgmental terms. So a lot of the research process involved putting myself into the headspace of people who were incredibly hostile to the people that I was writing about, and, you know, would have been incredibly hostile to me too. It was quite a sort of politically and emotionally difficult process sometimes, getting into that headspace in order to know what terms to search for, if you like, in order to know what phrases these people were going to be writing about with people with, so that I could pinpoint the sources.
Because we might have not otherwise known of certain individuals without these negative accounts written by others about them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite individuals in the book, an early American trans and intersex person called Thomas or Thomasine Hall, depending on when they lived. The reason that they become visible to the archive is because they are embroiled in a court case in the early 17th century in Virginia. And that court case was initially about fornication because they'd had sex outside of marriage, but the court case actually very quickly becomes about what is your gender. And we have on legal record in the courtroom Thomas or Thomasine stating, "I am both man and woman," which is an absolutely fantastic piece of evidence that people were identifying in ways very, very similar to what we might describe as non-binary now in the early 17th century. But the only reason that that's visible is because of the oppressive situation in the courtroom that that person found themselves in.
Do we know what caused Thomas or Thomasine? Did you say the other?
They went by Thomas or Thomasine.
Thomas. Do we know what they meant by saying I'm both man and woman?
So they seem to have meant both that they were intersex, so they describe their body in some detail, although brilliantly the manuscript is damaged such that we can't tell exactly how they describe their body, so their privacy is kind of accidentally protected by the damage to this manuscript. So they mean partly that they were intersex, but they also mean partly that they lived as a man sometimes and as a woman at other times. So they'd been born in Newcastle upon Tyne in the north of England. They'd lived as a woman while being a lace maker on the south coast of England. They'd lived as a man while fighting in the army. And then they seem to have, in their little community in Virginia, they seem to have lived as a man sometimes and as a woman at other times, because one of their employers was utterly convinced they were a man. Another employer was utterly convinced they were a woman. This is a community of only about sort of just over 30 people. So it's quite impressive, really, that they maintained that level of gender fluidity in that society. So, yeah, when they say I am both man and woman, they mean that both in terms of their body and in terms of how they lived. And that's an important point. One of the reasons I write about their story is to make the point about how trans and intersex histories overlap a lot of the time.
Tell me about the distinction between the two.
So when we talk about intersex people, we're talking about people whose bodies don't fit into the category that our society calls male in terms of biology, or the category that our society calls female in terms of biology. I'm being very specific in the way that I describe those categories, because they're socially constructed categories. There's no reason why we should label particular bodies or sets of body parts in one way or another way. But there are plenty of people who don't fit into either of those socially constructed biological boxes. When I talk about trans people, I'm talking about people who don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. So it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about their body, but it does tell you about how they identify and or how they live.
People who live their lives both as a man and a woman is a theme that you find in history. And going back even, 3,500 years ago to Egypt, we have Queen Hatshepsut. This is a fascinating story. You write about Queen Hatshepsut. Tell me about this person.
So Hatshepsut is a monarch who was assigned female at birth, but who, when they became pharaoh, became specifically King Hatshepsut. And the reason that I write about their story is to talk about the way that in the past and in the present, in different cultures, people can be gendered differently depending on the role that they have in society. So if you think of being a pharaoh as an intrinsically male thing, then if someone becomes a pharaoh, regardless of what gender they were assigned at birth, regardless of what their body's like, they will be treated as male. And Hatshepsut is referred to with kind of mixtures of pronouns in certain sources. They're depicted with breasts and a beard, so they're depicted in ways that suggest that their body also blurs those boundaries. And we don't know very much about how they understood themselves. But the point that I really wanted to get across in the book is, first of all, that their society understood them in a way that blurs the boundaries of male and female. But also, if you are someone who grows up in a society where you're told again and again to be a pharaoh is to be male, if you then become a pharaoh, that is naturally going to also affect how you understand yourself in some way.
How has Hatshepsut been received in history and by historians?
It's interesting because with a lot of these figures whose gender was seen differently because of the social role that they occupied, the narrative that tends to be told in history, and this is totally understandable, but the narrative that tends to be told in history is that these are women who managed to bravely make their way in a patriarchal world. And that is part of the story. A lot of the histories I talk about in the book could be interpreted in more than one way. So these are people, for example, who are part of both women's history and trans history, and women feeling a connection to someone like Hatshepsut as a really important feminist role model doesn't take away from trans people also feeling a connection to Hatshepsut as someone who disrupted the boundaries of male and female. But that feminist interpretation of Hatshepsut has been the predominant one. The idea that, Hatshepsut just had to be seen as a man in order to make her way, quote unquote, in a patriarchal society. And it's very true that it was a patriarchal society. But I think what that narrative does is it never allows for any trans possibility in history. It never allows for anything more complicated than male and female. It never allows for those the acknowledgement that actually Hatshepsut was understood in a way that did disrupt ideas of maleness and femaleness and did disrupt gender categories. And therefore, it never allows for a history to trans experience today. We hear a lot in kind of politicized narratives this is a new thing. And we're only going to perpetuate that idea that's a new thing if we keep perpetuating the idea that Hatshepsut was definitely just a woman in a man's world, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating time, though, to be looking at history once again. We always look at history with our current day values, hence the previous descriptions that we've had over the last 100 years or so. But it seems like this is a very ripe time to look back at history and re-examine some cases like this and histories like this.
I mean, I think so, certainly, yeah. We're in a situation where the claimed newness of trans identities is being used against us by our opponents. So the idea that we are new and therefore shouldn't be taken seriously, or that we're new and we're a new threat that everybody must be very vigilant against, those ideas are all based on the idea that this has no history. And that is oppressive not just for trans people, but for everybody who is being told oh, there is a traditional way to be. There are traditional gender binaries. There are traditional ways to be a man or a woman. Actually, what constitutes a man or a woman or gender itself has been being redefined throughout history. And of course, the binary idea of gender that that you and I have been socialized with is very much a Western social construct. And so revealing that there is this history, it's not just liberating for trans people. I think it's liberating for everybody.
Can you outline for me this redefining of gender through time? I mean, it's a big question. I recognize that.
That's a huge question, but I can give one example. So if you had been alive in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, what you wore in terms of your clothes would have been understood to actually affect who you were. So they wrote about changing your clothes as changing the truth of your very nature. If you're a man and you put on a dress, for example, it changes the truth of your very nature. And that's not how we understand it now. Of course, we understand clothes as just a costume that we put on over a self, and our self is always the same underneath. But that's not always been the case. Clothes have, in the past, been a really fundamental aspect of who we are in terms of our gender. And things like what we do in society, the way we behave, has also been taken into account in terms of our gender. If you look at medieval accounts of what you should do with an intersex person, what gender you should assign an intersex person at birth, these accounts not only talk about the body, but they also talk about, does this person have a loud voice or not? Does this person prefer hanging out with women or with men? That should also be taken into account in what we think this person's real gender is. So those are examples of how what we think of gender being has always been up for debate and has never just been something that's about what your body is like.
You do have a chapter looking at England during the reign of Elizabeth I. Tell me about gender there. I mean, I think this is also a time of Shakespeare, Shakespeare's plays. We know men. I don't know if this is relative, but men played women parts in plays. I think we assume that was because women didn't just have opportunities to do it, weren't allowed to do it. But what did you find in this period?
This is a period that I really enjoy writing about because it's where I sort of came to my historical specialism, if you like. It's the period that I'm most familiar with. And so part of what I write about in that period is panics over gender non-conforming fashion. So an absolute panic in the early years of King James I of England and VI of Scotland over the idea of women or people assigned female at birth wearing quote unquote men's clothes, including hats. They were most terrified about women wearing hats. James actually asked all the preachers in London to preach vehemently against this practice because it was causing women to, and I quote, transform into men just by wearing men's clothes. So partly that's what I talk about. And then you mention men or boys or people assigned male at birth playing women's roles on the stage. And that absolutely is relevant. So you're right that the reason behind it was because women or people assigned female at birth were forbidden from acting. So that didn't become legalized until the 1660s in England. But the effect of it was, again, to make people think really, really differently about gender. A brilliant historian called Simone Chess has done research on what happened to the boys who played women's parts on the stage. What happened to them once they grew up, once, their voices broke and they hit puberty? Because it had often been assumed that they just, they graduated and they went on to play sort of normative men's roles. But what Simone Chess's work showed is that actually they didn't. They remained seen as not straightforwardly male for the rest of their lives. So they only ever played kind of queer-coded roles or roles where a lot of the jokes relied on you knowing that this person had used to dress as a woman. Some of them were still being described as beautiful women, even kind of much, much, much later on in their lives. They were still being seen as not straightforwardly male. So there was this real kind of residue to the roles that they played. And I talk in the book as well about the more recent history of that, the history of people assigned male at birth playing female roles on the stage, and some of those people using it as an opportunity to actually express their gender in the way they wanted to.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Kit Heyam. Kit Heyam is a university lecturer, a queer history activist, and a trans awareness trainer. They are the author of the book that we are in conversation about called Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. Kit Heyam, do we see a transformation of how we see gender then, say, from this 17th century up to now? Is there a moment where we get this more sort of 20th century version of gender that people that, sort of at issue today?
There are certainly moments, and they come about with kind of increasing developments in scientific thought in the 19th and 20th centuries. So first of all, one of the key moments in the construction of our essentialized idea of gender is the eugenics movement. So, which, among other things, popularized the racist idea that white people's bodies were more perfectly divided into male and female than the bodies of people of color. So the idea that we have a really strict sex binary is itself a racist social construct, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the book. So those ideas popularize the idea that we that there is a binary understanding of sex. And it was then more recent still, in the mid-20th century, that the idea of gender having something to do with your body, gender being essentialized biologically, came about through basically as a consequence of research into the existence of intersex people. So I'd recommend, if people are interested in this, reading the work of a fantastic trans historian, Jules Gill-Peterson, who's written about the history of the transgender child. She writes about it in much more detail than I could go into here. But essentially what happened is that scientists discovered that intersex people existed. So they discovered sex was not, in fact, a binary. It was a spectrum. They panicked. And so they invented the idea of binary gender being somehow natural in order to sort of stabilize the what they saw as the natural order. So, if you've realized sex is a spectrum, what can you do to reestablish what you think of as the natural order of things? You invent gender stereotypes and you say these are natural, and if someone doesn't conform to them, it must be something wrong with them biologically.
Stabilize the natural order. Do you think that's what people are trying to do right now?
I do. I think.
And I say natural order, of course, there are parentheses around that.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot you could say about this, but I think certainly in an era which has seen enormous destabilization, in terms of the climate, in terms of our economies, one of the things that people reach towards is things they feel like they can be sure of. And unfortunately, sometimes those are really repressive ideas, such as binary and stereotypes and essentialized ideas of gender.
Going back to the time of eugenics, of racism, when you pointed out that white people said that they had a more perfect distinction between gender. Is this related to maybe it's just related to straight racism, but is it also related to colonization and just experiencing different cultures and how different people perceived gender?
Yeah, I think it's probably impossible to unpick the chicken and egg relationship between colonialism and racism. But I do think that, yes, the observation of the fact that not every culture had a Western gender binary, that in fact, many, many cultures did not. I've talked about North American Two-Spirit people already. Another example would be Hijras in North America. In India and Pakistan. That certainly led white people to think about whether they could explain those differences in quote-unquote scientific terms rather than in simple terms of cultural difference without assigning value to them. I write in one chapter of my book about the Hijras of India and Pakistan and about British colonizers' attempts to literally eradicate Hijras because they saw them as so disorderly and disruptive, and again, disruptive to what they saw as quote-unquote the natural order. Tell
me more about the Hijras.
So Hijras are people in the Indian subcontinent in South Asia who are usually assigned male at birth and who present in a feminine way. Sometimes they understand themselves as trans women. Sometimes they understand themselves as non-binary. Sometimes they understand themselves simply as hijras in a way that's not translatable. And they understand their gender identity often in spiritual ways as well. That's one of the things I write about in the book, in terms of having particular spiritual roles in their societies. And yes, they've existed for a very, very long time. But as I said, British colonizers attempted to eradicate them, partly because they saw their gender expression as disruptive, partly because they saw their kind of itinerance and their presence in public space, their musical performances, as disruptive to what they thought of as a civilized society, partly also because they didn't live in what they understood as the kind of natural nuclear family. So they lived instead in lineage groups. Sometimes they adopted children. They had a much more kind of fluid family and household structure than the British wanted people to have. And so for all of those reasons, they were seen as disorderly and as something that should be eradicated.
Is this something important to think about today and for do you see a connection between that and today?
I certainly see a connection between transphobia today and racism today in the same way as they've been linked in the past. Any attempt to say that there are not more than two ways of understanding gender is an attempt to erase the experiences of many, many people in non-Western cultures. And also it is, as I say, to ignore the fact that the whole entire reason we think there are only two sexes today is a reason rooted in eugenics and racism. And what I also think, though, is that the way a lot of white trans people tend to talk about the existence of genders other than male and female in cultures that are not their own can be quite a tokenizing one. It's very easy for white non-binary people to say, for example, obviously my gender is valid because two-spirit people exist and hydras exist. And then the conversation kind of stops there, and there's no attempt to understand those gendered experiences on their own cultural terms, and there's no attempt to think, what can I give as well as taking? Am I just going to take these genders in order to demonstrate the validity of my own without thinking about what those people are struggling for in contemporary society and what the harm might be that you're perpetuating by saying these people are the same as me? So I think there's a link between transphobia and racism, but there can also be a link between trans-affirming perspectives and racism if we're not careful to see these experiences on their own cultural terms.
Yeah, when you look at this history, you have to see it on their own terms, their own culture, within their own reality.
Exactly.
Tell me about colonization and gender roles in West Africa.
Yeah, so this is what I write about in the first chapter of my book. And it goes back to what I was saying about the relationship between how we understand people's genders and their roles in society. So I start that chapter by talking about Njinga Mbande, who was a monarch of Ndongo in the area that we now call Angola. And they were assigned female at birth, but when they became monarch, they became specifically king, not queen. And that's because the role of monarch was a gendered one in their society. But it's also because in order to be taken seriously by the Portuguese colonizers who were invading Ndongo at that time, they needed to fashion themselves as male. The Portuguese were not really up for taking a female monarch seriously. And Njinga had a lot of negotiation to do, both on a grand scale in terms of trying to protect their country and its autonomy, and also on a small scale in terms of trying to rescue the various members of their family who were abducted by the Portuguese. And in order to do that, they made a really strategic decision to emphasize that maleness, to say, again, I am the king. So the reason it's called colonization and gender roles is because it's impossible to separate the colonization and the fact that Njinga was negotiating with colonial powers from the decisions they made around their gender. It may be that had the Portuguese not invaded, Njinga would not have said, I am the king. They might have just remade ideas around what a monarch looked like in their culture. Or they might not. We can't know for sure. But colonization was a process that changed the way people represented their gender and the way people experienced their gender in that area in really, really material ways.
Tell me about what you found in early America.
So I've talked a little bit about Thomas or Thomasine Hall already. Just to finish their story, because the way their story ends is fascinating. So they say, I am both man and woman in the court of law. And instead of saying, no, you have to be one or the other, the court turns around and says, okay, you're both. We're going to make sure it's obvious that you're both. So their sentence is to dress in a mixture of male and female clothing for the rest of their life. And that's really interesting because in some ways that's kind of affirming. It's affirming that, yes, you are both man and woman. We believe you.
And meant as a punishment. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And in other ways, what it does is it removes their capacity for fluidity. So they've previously been living as a man sometimes, as a woman sometimes. Now they're always marked out as someone who is in between, someone who is stigmatized, effectively. So it's a really interesting story of this court partly affirming, but also partly shutting down the fluidity with which Thomas or Thomasine had lived. But still incredibly surprising, I think, for a lot of people to know that the idea of I am both man and woman could be affirmed by a court in early America. And then the other stories I tell from North America are stories of the lives of two-spirit people. And one of my favorite people who I write about in the book is a fantastic figure called Kaushuma Nupika, who not only was a prophet, and I write about the spiritual nature of their two-spirit identity, the fact that they transformed into a man as part of a spiritual vision, but also was an incredibly important intertribal negotiator and negotiator between Native American and First Nations people and the white fur traders who were in the area. And in order to do so, did amazing things like walking the entire length of the Columbia River, which is something that someone would certainly struggle to do today, let alone in a period without so much hiking equipment as we might have now. And their story is really important, as I say, partly because they were a fantastic and influential person, but partly because it helps us to get into the mindset of the many people for whom gender nonconformity is an inherently spiritual experience. As I say, their gender transformation took place as part of a spiritual vision, and it was after transforming into a man that they became a prophet and became really spiritually important. So that's
how do we still know that story?
Their story is preserved mostly in the diaries and accounts of white fur traders, and also then some anthropologists who went round and talked to people who'd known them after their death, and kind of took oral histories. This is a really, really big example of what I was talking about earlier about the sources being anthropological and racist ones, and having to read between the lines to work out what was motivating this person and what they were feeling, and not take at face value these white fur traders saying everybody rejected them because they were clearly, a pervert, some of the words they use, which there's no actual evidence for, apart from this person wanting to impose their own prejudice narrative.
Tell me about World War I internment camps.
So the stories I tell about World War I internment camps in the book are about gender nonconformity on the stage. So I guess a little bit of background is needed to explain the internment camps in the first place. The camps I'm talking about are not prisoner of war camps. They're camps for people who were from quote unquote enemy countries who happened to be present in Britain at the outbreak of the First World War. So this included people who'd worked there for centuries, just hadn't been naturalized as citizens. It included people who were on holiday at the wrong time, whole bunch of people with different backgrounds, who were all locked up from the very start of the war, and then increasingly after the torpedoing of the passenger liner, the Lusitania, by a German U-boat in 1915, there were attacks on German civilians. And so the British government was able to say, well, we're locking you up for your own protection. So they locked people up, and these were only people assigned male at birth of military age. And they were not allowed to work. So they weren't doing forced labor like prisoners of war, but they also couldn't do their normal jobs. So in order to find kind of something to do to preserve their mental health, they took on various activities, including setting up theatres. And in order to find people to play the women in these theatres, some people played female roles on the stage. Now, so far so normal, you might say. Obviously, they just had to have some people to play female roles. But some of those people, when they stepped off the stage, they did not take off their female clothing and they did not take off their female identities. And they actually started using women's names and she, her pronouns full time within the camps. They ended up living for years as women within the internment camps. And there have been lots of explanations suggested for this. Some people have said, oh, it was a way to legitimize sexual relationships between people in the camps, and probably it did do that in part. Some people have said it was a way to kind of create a sense of home from home. People were really missing their normal societies, and so they needed some women to make it feel more like home. But what people haven't said as much, and what I think is really important, is that for some people, this was an opportunity to live in the way that they'd always wanted to live. You know, no one was forcing these people to live as women. And sure, some of them were probably motivated sexually, and some of them were probably motivated by wanting to create that home from home, but some of them were also probably motivated by their experience of their own gender and by actually it being really important for them to be called by women's names and she, her pronouns for that duration of that time.
That's really fascinating. What's the historical record like for these women? And I mean, this we're now talking about the 20th century. Were any of them interviewed? Did anyone give their own account?
There's a very few. So what we have, first of all, we have camp newspapers. So they publish camp newspapers within the camps, and sometimes you get accounts by these people who lived as women. Sometimes you also, and this is interesting in its own way, get accounts of people who played women's roles on the stage, but saying, it's just a role, I'm not a woman, which is actually great because it shows that the people who weren't writing that, you know, nobody was forcing them to say, I am a woman and to go along with it. So you get camp newspapers, you get the diaries of other prisoners who clearly really changed their opinions on gender through meeting these people, actually. They end up writing things like, oh, I've learned that no male is simply male and no female is simply female. Then you also have a few letters written by the people themselves, many of whom talk about the feeling of transforming into a woman when they step on the stage, about they're having this, you know, what we would describe as a temporary trans experience. And we also, at the same time, this is the beginning of sexology, which I mentioned earlier, the kind of scientific study of sexuality and gender. And so you have some case studies from trans people, and you have trans women saying, when I was younger, I always took the opportunity to play women's roles on the stage if I could, because it was a way to express myself. So we have evidence that trans women are starting to kind of articulate this, and that people were thinking in those terms at the time. So even if we don't have people from the camps saying, this is how I felt, we have evidence that this is how trans women in general felt at the time, and that was something that they could articulate.
Even beyond these camps, and you perhaps have addressed part of this question just now, but Kit Heyam, in your large survey of history that you have done, were you able to find good firsthand accounts on the people themselves that you write about?
It's really varied because it depends a lot on, as I say, whether someone comes into contact with kind of medical authorities, like I was talking about, or legal authorities, and also on class. A lot of the time, I'm talking about people who wouldn't necessarily have had the opportunity to even necessarily learn how to write, actually, but certainly to be able to publish their own accounts or leave any trace. And so what I'm doing a lot of the time instead is talking about the history of people understanding gender as something that could be disrupted and redefined and challenged, and cases of large numbers of people, among whom there will have been some who thought this is just a costume or a joke, and there will have been some who thought this is really important to my identity. And just because we don't have those first-hand accounts doesn't mean we should dismiss one possibility but not dismiss the other. You see what I mean?
Yeah. And again, as somebody who has done a survey on this history and has dived into this history, you had to disentangle a lot of what is written about these people because of the biases that the people that did leave records had of the folks that they were writing about. I mean, that's not, I guess, entirely different than historians of Native Americans or really a lot of different histories, I guess, are like that. There's that saying, and maybe it's not true anymore, and maybe it was never true, but there's that saying, history is written by the victors.
Yeah, and history is written, I would go further, by the people whose objectivity is not called into question. And what that means is the people who are not marginalized in their contemporary society. So essentially by white, cis, straight men the majority of the time. And so what that means is that when, trans people like me come to write trans histories, we're automatically seen as suspect and biased, but we are no less biased than cis people or anyone who is writing about an experience that's not their own. Just because we are seen as other from the norm doesn't mean that we're automatically less objective. I don't think anybody can be objective. I think there's just different standards about who is seen to count as objective and who isn't.
Your bias is immediate. I mean, you are accused of being biased immediately, whereas these other accounts are sort of already accepted as the authoritative.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Once we do get to a transgender identity, does that shift, do you think, how these things, how gender fluidity is seen and perceived?
Yes, and not always in a positive way, to be honest, because once we get clear articulations of transgender or transsexual identity, we also get, the positive is we get support for trans people. We get trans people being able to access the medical care that we want. But then we get very entrenched and codified standards about what a real trans person is. And it becomes, someone who conforms absolutely to gender stereotypes, someone whose gender is stable. So once they transition, they live very stably and consistently in the gender that they identify as, rather than being fluid or experimenting. And people who go through medical transition. And it's actually, what I argue in the book is those standards of what counts as a real trans person, in inverted commas, are standards which are really detrimental to doing history, because those standards did not exist in the past. And they are also standards that our historical sources often just can't meet. We tend to say now that someone only counts as a real trans person if they describe themselves firsthand as trans. But in the past, as we've talked about, people A, didn't have the language or concepts, and B, often didn't have the opportunity to express their identity at all or to leave a permanent record of it. So a lot of what I was trying to do in the book was to deconstruct those ideas of what a real trans person is, both in our contemporary society, because it's okay to be fluid and non-binary and experimental and playful and creative with gender, and as standards that we import back onto the past.
So in some ways in the past, it could be seen in some ways, again, as more fluid, because you just didn't have these categories in which we're putting everyone in.
Exactly. And, I would never say that the past was some sort of utopia where everybody was able to transgress categories freely. It depended a lot on your individual situation and the different kinds of privilege that you might have. But it's certainly true that with the codifying of trans categories today, we lost some fluidity that now I think is really important we claw back.
Is there a story in your book that you think is important that we didn't talk about, or one that's particularly a favorite of yours?
I think we've talked about almost all of the stories.
We got through all of it, didn't we?
Yeah, perhaps apart from the stories where sexuality and gender overlap. Because this is another case where I said a lot of the stories can be interpreted in multiple different ways. So we can talk about people as gay history and or as trans history. One of the people I write about, for example, is Anne Lister, who's been made famous, at least in the UK, by the TV show Gentleman Jack, who is incredibly important to lesbians today as someone who was assigned female at birth and expressed their attraction to women in really clear terms in their diary, but also expresses in their diary not wanting to be seen as a woman by their partners and presented in a gender non-conforming way. And seeing Anne Lister as part of lesbian history doesn't take away from seeing them as part of trans history, and vice versa, in part because a lot of the time in the past, those ideas of sexuality and gender have been entangled. They've not been clearly separable. What someone does or wants to do sexually has been seen to affect their gender, and vice versa. So those are some stories, that we've not mentioned, but that I think are really important.
What's the purpose of your book for you?
I think the purpose of my book is twofold. I think, first of all, it's really about showing that no matter what people might say today, gender has never been something that's fixed or unchallenged or has a fixed definition or is tied to the body. And that's important, as I've said, not just for trans people, but for everybody. And it's secondly about reclaiming the idea that we can have an emotional connection to the history that we write about, and that actually that can be a really positive thing because it teaches us to approach people in the past with an ethics of care and to want to see them on their own terms and to see them for who they are and who they wanted to be seen as. And both of those things are really important purposes of it for me.
Do you see it as part of the fight today on defining these issues?
I see the book as an important part of making it clear that trans experience and the defiance of gender categories is not something new. It's not a new trend. It's not a new threat. It's something that is as old as humanity itself. And we really need to refuse to fight our opponents on the terms they've set and argue about whether this has a history or not, and instead to raise awareness of these histories and to point out that they show us truths that are liberating for everybody.
Because that's what the opponents do, right? I mean, that's what they're saying, that it's always been male, female, this is new, this isn't real.
Exactly, and they're wrong.
Kit Heyam has been our guest. Again, Kit Heyam is the author of the book that we have been in conversation about. It's called Before We Were Trans, A New History of Gender. Kit Heyam, I have enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.